Hey, this is Bunny. Have you ever noticed that you can take the exact same dungeon, the exact same group of players, the exact same dungeon master, and the exact same goblin hiding behind the exact same suspicious barrel, yet the entire experience changes just because someone presses play on a different playlist? Suddenly, that goblin isn't just a little green nuisance anymore. With cheerful tavern music, he's basically an unpaid intern having the worst day of his life. Add ominous chanting and deep drums, and now everyone at the table is convinced that Greg the Goblin is secretly the chosen champion of an ancient evil. Music has that kind of power. It sneaks past logic, taps your emotions on the shoulder, and whispers, hey, maybe this broom closet is actually kinda terrifying. Today we're talking about one of my favorite invisible tools in tabletop gaming: music. It doesn't require expensive terrain or years of painting experience or an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure rulebooks. It simply changes how we experience the stories we tell together. One of my favorite things about tabletop role-playing games is that they're wonderfully incomplete. That sounds kind of like an insult, I know, but I promise it's one of the greatest compliments I can give them. Unlike a video game where every mountain is already modeled and every soundtrack is already written, a tabletop game hands you a collection of suggestions. The castle exists because everyone agrees it exists. The dragon is terrifying because everyone agrees it is. Your imagination is doing an incredible amount of heavy lifting every single session. Music becomes one more piece of that shared illusion. It gives everyone's imagination a gentle nudge in roughly the same direction. Instead of 6 people picturing 6 entirely different emotional tones, the soundtrack quietly says, how about we all panic together? It's remarkably efficient teamwork, if you ask me. What's fascinating is how quickly our brains respond to sound. You don't consciously decide that slow strings feel melancholy or that pounding drums feel dangerous. Your brain has been making those associations for years through movies, television, games, and life itself. The moment those sounds begin, your expectations shift before you've even rolled initiative. That's incredibly useful around the gaming table because the dungeon master no longer has to spend 5 uninterrupted minutes describing how gloomy the crypt feels. They can simply describe a few details with eerie music playing in the background. That music will do half the storytelling. Honestly, that's a pretty good trade. Dungeon masters already have enough to remember without also auditioning for dramatic theater every Saturday night. Of course, there's also the opposite problem. We've all heard the wrong music at exactly the wrong moment. Imagine delivering the emotional climax of a tragic campaign. The beloved mentor has fallen. Rain pours from the heavens. The heroes kneel in silence. And suddenly someone's playlist decides now is the perfect time for upbeat pirate fiddle music. Congratulations! The funeral has become an accidental Renaissance fair. Nobody intended it, but now half the table is trying not to laugh because the emotional atmosphere has been hit by what can only be described as a musical frying pan. It's almost impossible to recover at that point. Somewhere, the villain is giving his heartfelt monologue while sounding like he's about to sell everyone discounted turkey legs. That's because music doesn't just fill silence, it provides context. Think about walking into a restaurant. If soft jazz is playing, you expect one kind of evening. If heavy metal is blasting through the speakers, while someone delicately presents creme brulee, you're going to have a few questions. Probably several questions. Maybe safety concerns. Our brains constantly use background sound to predict what kind of experience we're about to have. Tabletop games work exactly the same way. Gentle woodland music tells everyone they're entering an enchanted forest. Low drones suggest forgotten ruins. Joyful tavern tunes immediately encourage players to relax, joke with NPCs, and spend entirely too much money on fictional cheese. Seriously, adventurers have some astonishing priorities. I think that's why silence deserves just as much respect as music. This sounds strange in a video entirely about music, but hear me out. Continuous background sound eventually fades into the scenery because our brains adapt remarkably quickly. If every single conversation has dramatic orchestral accompaniment, then eventually dramatic orchestral accompaniment becomes the new normal. It stops feeling dramatic. But remove the music entirely just before the final confrontation, and suddenly every dice roll sounds enormous. Every pause feels deliberate. Every player leans forward just a little bit. Silence becomes its own soundtrack. It's like seasoning and cooking. You don't improve every recipe by dumping in an entire container of garlic powder. Well, for most recipes anyway. One of my favorite examples comes from horror campaigns. Horror isn't really about the monsters. Monsters are just oversized problems with questionable social skills. Horror is about uncertainty. It's about wondering what's behind the next door, whether the strange scratching noise is meaningful, and why absolutely nobody in this village seems capable of making eye contact. Music can support that uncertainty beautifully when it's subtle. Constant jump scare noises usually have the opposite effect because players become numb to them. Gentle ambient sounds, distant echoes, soft wind, maybe the occasional unsettling note that never quite resolves. Suddenly, everyone begins inventing horrors that are much scarier than anything you could actually describe. Our imaginations are wonderfully talented at terrifying ourselves. Fantasy music often gets treated as though it's all interchangeable, but it's really not. Compare the feeling of Celtic-inspired folk music to grand orchestral battle themes or haunting choral pieces. They're all fantasy, yet they create entirely different worlds. One suggests wandering through green hills with friendly villages where every baker secretly knows local gossip. Another makes you feel like kingdoms are rising and falling before lunch. The third convinces you that opening an ancient stone door is definitely going to awaken something that should have remained asleep for another 1,000 years. Choosing music is a little like choosing paint colors for a miniature. Tiny changes create surprisingly different emotional results, even when the overall subject stays exactly the same. As someone who spends an awful lot of time painting miniatures, I've noticed a funny parallel. Good painting doesn't usually scream for attention. Instead, it quietly supports the illusion that this tiny figure belongs in a much larger world. Music often does exactly the same thing during a role-playing session. When it's working well, people stop talking about the soundtrack entirely because they're too busy experiencing the adventure it helps create. Nobody stops halfway through an emotional boss fight to compliment the violins. They're busy wondering whether their cleric has enough spell slots left to prevent the barbarian from becoming tomorrow's cautionary tale. And honestly, that's probably where everyone's attention should be, because the barbarian is about to become tomorrow's cautionary tale. Then there's the curious phenomenon of musical nostalgia. Certain pieces become permanently attached to specific campaigns without anyone planning it. Years later, you'll hear 30 seconds of a particular melody while shopping for groceries, and suddenly you'll remember the wizard who accidentally teleported the entire party into a chicken coop. You won't remember what brand of cereal you came to buy, but you'll absolutely remember Sir Cluckles, defender of the barnyard. Music has an incredible ability to anchor memories in ways that surprise us. Long after character sheets have disappeared and campaign notebooks have gathered dust, those melodies can reopen entire adventures that felt lost to time. That's a remarkable kind of magic, and unlike casting Fireball indoors, it's generally appreciated by everyone involved. I think one of the funniest things about tabletop music is how dramatically players will misinterpret it. A dungeon master carefully selects an ominous track simply because the cave is old and mysterious. Within 15 seconds, every player at the table has reached the same conclusion. Well, we're definitely going to die. Nobody wants to touch the suspicious door anymore. Nobody trusts the perfectly ordinary mushroom patch. Someone begins checking for traps in places where traps physically cannot exist. The poor dungeon master is sitting there thinking, it's literally just a cave with 2 bears. Meanwhile, the players have convinced themselves that they're about to awaken an ancient cosmic horror that feeds exclusively on overconfident adventurers and people who forgot to bring enough healing potions. Music also has an incredible talent for making victories feel earned. Think about those moments when the battle has gone sideways. The fighter is hanging on by a handful of hit points. The wizard has burned through nearly every spell slot. The rogue has somehow managed to fail 3 stealth checks in a row, which is honestly impressive in its own tragic way. Then the tide begins to turn. The music swells, the dice suddenly remember how numbers work, and the final attack lands. Objectively, nothing about the mathematics has changed. A 20-sided die is still a 20-sided die. Yet emotionally, that victory feels 10 times larger because the soundtrack helped build the journey toward it. Of course, we shouldn't ignore the practical side of things either. Music can actually help cover those awkward little gaps that naturally happen during a game. Maybe someone is looking up a spell. Maybe the dungeon master is frantically flipping through notes because the party has ignored the obvious quest and decided to negotiate with the decorative fountain instead. Don't laugh. I've seen players attempt diplomacy with furniture more than once. Now, background music fills those little pauses so they don't feel quite so pause-like. Instead of everyone sitting in complete silence wondering whether they've accidentally broken reality, the atmosphere continues moving forward until the game catches up with itself. There's also a wonderful lesson here for miniature painters. We often focus entirely on the visual side of creating an experience, and understandably so. We spend hours layering highlights, carefully choosing colors, and trying to make tiny pieces of plastic or resin look like they belong in another world. That's the part of the hobby I absolutely adore. But our painted miniatures usually end up on gaming tables where they're joined by voices, laughter, snacks, dramatic storytelling, questionable tactical decisions, and hopefully a soundtrack that supports everything else. Painting creates one layer of immersion. Music creates another. Neither replaces the other. Together they make the table feel far richer than either could accomplish alone. Different genres also benefit from completely different musical philosophies. High fantasy loves sweeping orchestras and heroic themes because these stories often revolve around kingdoms, legends, and impossibly large stakes. A cozy village adventure might call for cheerful acoustic instruments that make every innkeeper sound like they bake exceptional pies. Gothic horror prefers restraint, allowing unsettling sounds to linger in the background instead of shouting for attention. A pirate campaign practically demands energetic sea shanties and adventurous melodies. Science fiction leads towards electronic textures and synthetic sounds that immediately tell your brain you're somewhere unfamiliar. Every genre has its own musical vocabulary, and learning those differences is almost like learning another storytelling language. Interestingly, some of my favorite sessions have used surprisingly little music at all. Instead of maintaining a constant soundtrack, the Dungeon Master saved it for particularly important moments. When it finally appeared, everyone noticed. It was almost like another character had entered the room. Suddenly, this conversation mattered more. The battle was different. This discovery was significant. That's something I think applies to creative hobbies in general. We sometimes assume more is automatically better. More weathering, more special effects, more glowing runes, more dramatic music. But restraint often creates stronger moments because the audience hasn't become accustomed to constant intensity. If everything is spectacular, then eventually spectacular starts feeling surprisingly ordinary. Another thing music quietly accomplishes is helping everyone maintain a shared pace. Fast, energetic tracks naturally encounter quicker decisions and more animated conversations. Slow, ambient pieces invite careful exploration and thoughtful role-playing. It's subtle enough that people rarely notice it's happening, but the entire table often begins moving in rhythm with the soundtrack without even realizing it. Suddenly, the investigation feels patient. The chase feels frantic. The peaceful campfire scene actually becomes peaceful instead of immediately devolving into arguments about whether somebody remembered to feed the mule. Honestly, tabletop groups are wonderfully talented at turning 5-minute rests into 45-minute philosophical debates about rope ownership. One aspect I really appreciate is that music helps reward emotional investment instead of mechanical success. Not every memorable moment comes from defeating the dragon or discovering legendary treasure. Sometimes it's two characters finally reconciling after weeks of disagreement. Sometimes it's saying goodbye to an NPC everyone unexpectedly grew attached to. Sometimes it's deciding not to fight at all. Gentle music can elevate those quieter moments every bit as effectively as triumphant battle themes elevate combat. That's important, because tabletop role-playing isn't really about winning. It's about creating stories together, and the best stories usually contain both loud victories and quiet conversations that linger long after the dice stops rolling. As painters, we're already accustomed to thinking about mood whether we realize it or not. A bog monster painted in bright candy colors creates a different impression than one covered in deep greens, muddy browns, and subtle earth tones. A heroic knight standing on a sunny hill tells a pretty different story than that same knight standing beneath storm clouds. Every artistic decision nudges the viewer toward a particular emotional response. Music simply performs the same task through sound instead of color. Both are trying to answer the same question. How should this moment feel? Once you start thinking about it that way, you begin noticing just how many invisible creative decisions shape every memorable gaming session. Perhaps that's why I love this hobby so much. Tabletop gaming isn't just one creative activity pretending to wear different hats. It's dozens of creative hobbies working together. Painting miniatures contributes visual storytelling. Terrain building creates believable worlds. Writing invents memorable characters. Dungeon masters weave the adventures. Players bring unpredictable decisions that somehow derail every carefully prepared plan in the most entertaining ways possible. Then music quietly slips into the background, connecting all those individual pieces into something that feels bigger than any one person could create alone. None of us could build that experience entirely by ourselves, but together we somehow convince a group of adults that a handful of dice and tiny painted figures are the most important thing in the universe for the evening. The next time you sit down for a game, pay attention to the soundtrack for just a few minutes. Notice how it changes the pace of conversations, how it colors your expectations, and how easily it can transform an ordinary room into a forgotten ruin, a bustling tavern, or a mist-covered swamp. It may not be the first thing players remember when they describe an amazing campaign, but it often becomes the thread quietly tying those memories together. That's a kind of magic that doesn't require spell slots, enchanted artifacts, or legendary heroes. All it requires is the right melody arriving at exactly the right moment. And honestly, that's pretty magical all by itself. Of course, there is one universal law of tabletop gaming that transcends every rulebook ever printed. If you spend 3 hours carefully assembling the perfect playlist for your session, your players will immediately decide to spend the entire evening opening a bakery. You prepared haunting cathedral music. They want cheerful market tunes because they've become obsessed with finding cinnamon. The epic boss battle soundtrack waits patiently while the barbarian negotiates wholesale flower prices. The mysterious forest ambiance sits unused because the rogue has become emotionally invested in designing a company logo for Critical Crest Bakery. This is not a failure. This is tabletop gaming functioning exactly as intended. If your players consistently surprise you, congratulations. They're paying attention to the world instead of following railroad tracks. That unpredictability is actually one of the reasons music works so well in role-playing games. Unlike films where every scene unfolds exactly the same way every time, tabletop sessions breathe. Conversations become longer. Battles become shorter. Someone decides to adopt the goblin instead of fighting him. Another player attempts to convince an owlbear that everyone simply got off on the wrong foot. The soundtrack has to be flexible enough to accommodate all of these delightful, chaotic choices. Rather than dictating the story, it supports whatever bizarre direction the story decides to wander. It's less like conducting an orchestra and more like politely jogging behind a group of caffeinated squirrels carrying dice. There's also something wonderfully communal about everyone hearing the same music at the same time. We spend a lot of our lives wearing headphones or listening to personalized playlists and consuming entertainment individually. Around the gaming table, however, the soundtrack becomes a shared experience. Everyone hears the same ominous choir. Everyone laughs when the tavern music begins, just as the bard unsuccessfully attempts to flirt with someone who clearly wants to be left alone. Everyone feels the tension rise together. That shared emotional landscape is surprisingly powerful because it reminds us that tabletop games are fundamentally social experiences. They're about creating memories with friends, not simply completing objectives or collecting treasure. One thing I appreciate is that good game music rarely demands attention for its own sake. It knows the role. Imagine trying to roleplay an emotional conversation while a full opera singer is passionately performing at maximum volume in the background. That's not atmosphere anymore, that's competition. Great tabletop music supports the players instead of competing with them. It provides emotional texture without constantly shouting, "Hey, look at me, I'm dramatic." That's a lesson that applies to many creative pursuits. Sometimes the strongest artistic choice is knowing when to quietly support the main performance instead of trying to become it. As miniature painters, we understand that principle instinctively. Think about adding a base to your figure. A beautifully painted miniature standing on an equally beautiful base can look incredible. But if the base becomes so elaborate that nobody notices the miniature anymore, something has gone a little sideways. The base exists to support the story being told by the figure. Music serves much the same purpose in role-playing games. It frames the adventure. It enriches the atmosphere. It adds context. But the stars of the evening are still the players. Their characters, and the ridiculous decisions they somehow justify with complete confidence, are the center of the show. No soundtrack on Earth can explain why the wizard thought licking the glowing crystal was a sensible scientific experiment, and yet here we are. Here we always are. Every session. And why is it always the wizard? He's the problem, at least in our group. He's always the problem. Anyway, speaking of ridiculous decisions, have you noticed how certain songs seem to become permanently associated with specific player habits? Maybe every time the sneaky rogue begins scouting ahead, a particular tense piece of music starts playing. Eventually, everyone hears those first few notes and immediately says, "Well, someone's about to ignore the rest of the party again." Before long, the music itself becomes an inside joke. It develops its own personality within that particular campaign. The soundtrack stops being just background audio and starts becoming part of the group's shared language. That's one of those little things that you really can't manufacture on purpose. It simply grows naturally over months of adventure, terrible dice rolls, and unforgettable stories. I've often wondered whether miniature painting has its own equivalent, and I think it does. There are certain color combinations that instantly transport me back to a particular project. A specific shade of swamp green reminds me of painting monsters late in the evening while rain tapped against the windows. Rich bronze makes me think of the dwarven cities I spent so much time on. Pale blue-gray always brings those frozen landscapes to mind. Just as music forms emotional associations, so do colors. Creative hobbies are full of these invisible connections. We think we're simply choosing a paint or selecting a playlist, but we're quietly building emotional shortcuts that our brains will revisit for years afterward. Another reason I encourage people to experiment with music is that there's really no universally correct answer. Some groups adore sweeping cinematic scores. Others prefer subtle ambient sounds. Some want complete silence except during major encounters. Every table develops its own unique personality. That's worth remembering because comparison can sneak into hobbies in all sorts of strange ways. You don't have to run your campaign like anyone else's. You don't have to paint like anyone else. You certainly don't have to use the exact playlist that someone on the internet declared to be the definitive fantasy soundtrack. If your group is having fun and laughing together and telling memorable stories, congratulations, you've already succeeded. I think that music encourages us to slow down occasionally. Modern entertainment often moves at an incredible pace. Explosions every few minutes, constant action, endless urgency. Tabletop games don't always need that. Some of the best sessions I've ever heard about involve nothing more dramatic than sharing a meal in a quiet village, exploring an abandoned library, or watching the sunrise after surviving a difficult journey. Gentle music reminds everyone that these quieter scenes deserve attention too. They provide contrast. They allow characters to breathe. They make the eventual battles feel more meaningful because there was actually something peaceful worth protecting in the first place. As I'm sitting here painting this Bogbound Giant, it's hard not to think about how much atmosphere shapes our perception of a creature. Imagine meeting this same giant under bright blue skies with cheerful festival music playing nearby. It might seem lonely, misunderstood, or even oddly charming. Now place that identical creature knee-deep in mist, with slow, echoing music drifting across a marsh. Nothing about the miniature has changed, yet suddenly every footstep feels heavier. Every ripple in the water feels suspicious, and everyone at the table starts wondering whether turning around is still an option. That's the quiet power of music. It doesn't repaint the miniature. It repaints the moment. That's about it for today. I'd love to hear about that piece of music that instantly reminds you of an unforgettable campaign, or a hilarious player moment, or a favorite gaming memory, so be sure to leave a comment below. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!